This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with J. Kameron Carter, who teaches in the Department of African American Studies at University of California, Irvine. He has written numerous scholarly articles on race and religion and is the author of two books, Race, a Theological Account from 2008, and The Anarchy of Black Religion, a Mystic Song from 2023. With Sarah Jane Cervenak, he is the editor of the series Black Outdoors on Duke University Press. In this conversation, we discuss the place of religion and religious studies in the Black Studies tradition, how Black study treats community and ordinary life as sites of knowing and being, and how a commitment to the everyday opens up new horizons for the field of Black studies. Hello, Jay. How are you doing today?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm really happy we have a chance to talk today to get your thoughts on the field of Black studies, sort of thinking about the relation of your research to the field, boundaries it pushes, ways it's embedded in the field. I think that your work in religious studies is important. And that the work in religion is absolutely central to Black studies. I think it goes really underappreciated in many ways in the field, and I'm really excited to have a chance to hear you talk about your research in the field of religious studies and Black studies, but also because I really love your writing. I think it has an intensity and sincerity to it that is really unique. And when I think about Black studies, I think it's so important for that level of sincerity and real commitment. So looking forward to this. Thank you so much for making the time.
Absolutely. Truly looking forward to. I admire your work as well. We've had conversations before, so you've helped me navigate quite a bit of thinking through Caribbean thought, Gleesalt's work. So again, I'm just honored to be in a conversation with you.
Oh, thank you. That's really nice. I really appreciate that. So before we talk about the field of Black studies itself, I wanted to start with a more maybe intimate or personal question. Just ask you to narrate for us a little bit of how you came to Black studies, how you came to be a scholar whose primary concern is with Black life. What is it that drew you in? What kinds of experiences, moments, but also what sustained your commitment to the study of Black life and to Black studies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the way that I want to answer it, and that I've increasingly been thinking about that kind of question myself, is the place of my grandmother and my mother, and their influence on me. In many respects, I think they were. I've come to understand them as my first kind of like teachers of Black studies.
Interesting. I love that.
And in their own way, also of religious studies, where I don't have a clean line between those approaches, those areas, those disciplines. My mother passed away from cancer when I was pretty young. My grandmother stepped in and helped out, and to get us, me and my sisters, through our teenage years. And both of them had a deep effect on me, on my sisters as well. And in many ways, my work, I think, has been trying to make sense of those women in my life. How in some ways they carried me, how I was sustained by them. I could go into more details, but the most basic, bare bones level, I really do sort of feel that they're the primal and primary intellectuals, kind of like my North Star thinkers for what I do and what I'm trying to do. The book I just finished, The Anarchy of Black Religion, I concluded with a kind of meditation that's a kind of homage to my grandmother, and try to make something of an argument that you know, forget all the other highfalutin stuff I just said in the book. Well, don't forget it, but you know what I mean. You
Yeah.
know, put it in its place, but realize that all this other stuff I'm trying to do is a derivation from what I took them to be doing,
Mhm.
and my efforts to make sense of how they were constantly, Zora Neale Hurston's language, they were constantly making a way out of no way, the no way of Frank Rizzo's, violent Philadelphia.
Mhm.
And what were the ways of everyday living that they navigated? And in many respects, they taught me something in their very practices of navigation. And I've been trying for a very long time to make sense of it, to bring
Mhm.
it to some sort of articulation.
I love that. I mean, I think that, one of the things, and maybe we'll actually end up talking about this in more detail, but one of the things that's so interesting about Black Studies and talking about in this podcast series to people about their sort of origins, the origins of their interest, but also the nature of their research,
Mm-hmm.
is the expansive character of the archive and the
Yeah.
way everyday experience becomes less of a sort of inspiration and instead very much an intellectual resource, as you say, trying to make sense of something. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not just I felt supported. That's I lived a life of thoughtfulness, reckoning with this thoughtful origin. Yeah.
Absolutely. I often say my mother and my grandmother, they were philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean that in the sense, like they were doing the thing that we associate with professional philosophers, or that we might associate with enlightenment thinkers or whatever. I'm not saying that. I hope I'm saying something deeper and much more richer than that. I'm trying to say that their way of walking in the world, their way of dwelling on the earth, their way of walking the concrete and asphalt of Philadelphia, um, their way of nurturing gardens in the concrete jungle
Mm-hmm.
with a philosophical practice. That's what this
Absolutely.
was. Now, if that's true, I mean, how do I catch up with what they knew? They knew something, and they're doing something. And my job is to try to think after them, to think with and after them. At its bare bones, that's what I'm trying to do in my work. That's all I'm trying to do, which is
I
a lot.
love that. That is a lot. That is a lifelong task. It's a multi-generational task. I love that.
Absolutely. And the other thing I've learned is that they lived a form of life that you couldn't navigate this by yourself. And therefore, for me, Black Studies is not an independent gesture. It's not the gesture of a singular hero. We do this together. I had a friend of mine once tell me that some things you can think by yourself, but that doesn't mean you should.
Mm-hmm.
You got to think some things with other people. You need the kaleidoscopic perspective of of a multitude of, and not in that weak sense, but of a community, of a collective that's constantly entangled. That the thing we call the individual is a derivation of this prior entanglement. We got to think from that entanglement. Black Studies is the thought practice of working from that entanglement first. The thing we call the individual is just a reflex of that.
Man, I feel like already we've had like as much as I could expect from the podcast. I love this. No, I mean this nature of what we do as both connected to everyday life,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because in the end, I mean, you and I might have an elaborate, often opaque theoretical vocabulary, advanced degrees, and so forth, but we are also ordinary people trying to make sense of things that surround us. And,
Absolutely.
taking that seriously as a point of origin. And I really love that as a way of not just honoring, your mother and grandmother as people, but honoring the idea of people having to navigate the world philosophically, because in a world that's trying to make a certain kind of meaning and you want to make a different meaning for yourself, that's philosophical. Yeah.
That's the practice of philosophy at its best.
Yes, I'm a philosophy PhD. I have to say that's not the way it's often professionally practiced. But
Absolutely.
that's the way all these things hopefully have to exceed our institutionalization of it. Yeah.
Hmm.
So, so think of the institutionalization of Black studies, just to make a, a segue. Um, I'm thinking about the origin. When I think about the origins of Black studies, I find it's so interesting that it has these sort of twin imperatives, right? Or that are often in tension with each other, right? One is that it was generated by community demands and
Hmm.
imperatives about community connection between what happens on campuses and what was happening in terms of off campus, nationally, internationally, around demands for Black liberation and Black liberation struggle. But its origin was also looking around and saying, like, look, English departments, history departments, sociology departments, they don't represent Black life in any kind of significant way. And so that was also that imperative of Black studies, to create a space to interrogate, expand, and develop the sense of the Black intellectual tradition. And those complement each other in some ways because they come together in the same moment, but they also have a real tension right around the politics and intellectual life of what we call Black studies. And so I'm interested in your own imagination of Black studies. In some ways, you've already spoken to this question. How you think about the field in relation to this tense origin.
No, this is a beautiful and deep question. I've been thinking about aspects of this question with increased intensity lately. Um, I can get into why in a second, but let's just go to the question for now. It seems to me, I mean, I like this idea about the tension, and one way in which I narrate the tension is I read it as the tension between Black studies and Black study.
Yeah.
Right. The distinction between studies as a kind of university departmental disciplinary um, uh, term, and study, which exceeds, even if it's related to the university as an institution, and the kind of departmentalization and disciplinary separation of knowledges. And that's that tension that's the way I receive your question. At least I hear and process the question. On the one hand, you said the imperative of Black studies on one side is generated by community demands. In my mind, I sort of associate that with Black study, where Black study is about the study of life, an apprenticeship to how life is lived in its differential unit, in its unity without a unity without simple kind of replication of the same. It's a differential unity, right? I remember reading in one scholarly text, and it coined the word a neologism, tried to merge the word difference and unity, and called it diffunity, a diffused unity, diffunity. Black study is the study of life as diffunity, as the multiplicity of entangled realities. Whereas university departments, in many respects, are committed to a kind of segmentation and a kind of segregation of knowledges, and even a kind of hierarchization of those knowledges. Some knowledge protocols being more privileged than others, so on and so forth. And often these do follow lines between the kind of like secularized lines, those forms of knowledges that seem to be read as more scientific, therefore more secularized, get a certain kind of privilege over those forms of knowledge that might be more invested in the imagination or thinking through those things that are related to empirical realities but exceed just simple empirical realities. And that brings attention there. That brings attention because when the study of Black life then comes into the university, something happens at that point. When you subject it to university protocols of making sense, meaning making out of it, something happens then to the object of study, or at least something happens to the way in which we know the object of study. And it's that tension that I think we've got to work through and figure out. I've been thinking a lot about, the 1960s birth of kind of Black studies into, predominantly white PWI institutions, because that's kind of what we're talking about as well. The end of the 1960s, when you get the birth of Black studies departments, which also you get the birth of gender studies departments, women's studies departments, gender sexuality, all these kind of related ethnic studies departments. These related departments were a response to the kind of crises of the 1960s. To try and rectify that on some level in the university. And yet that happened at a cost. There was a price to be paid when that happened. And I think we're living in that tension. And I think another place where you see the tension is I've been thinking about the kind of formation of Black religious studies and why I think Black religious studies doesn't get the kind of attention that I think it should get in Black studies. I think a part of it comes down to this kind of, religion, secular, sacred, secular split that I think organizes knowledges in the university. And so in order to sort of put forth Black studies as a serious field of rigorous inquiry, in some sense, we had to kind of accede to the secularization paradigms of knowledge. Sorry about that. Which then meant that there were certain things that could not, that got short shrift in Black studies. They put pressure on that paradigm. And I think religious studies is one of those areas. And in fact, I've been toying with a book project. Actually, a couple of people told me I need to step into it. I'm a little worried because, I'm a kind of philosophical, theoretical thinker. I read history because I know I need historians to always help me, stay grounded in the material. But after they ground me, then I just sort of take off into flights of fancy. But this would be it would be a quasi philosophical, historical project. I'm really interested in that fluid moment, that fluid time, kind of the late 60s into the early 70s, when Black studies was still a kind of hot, molten lava. It had not congealed into something yet. It was still figuring itself out as it made its way into the university. And in that moment, there was a question about how the study of religion was going to figure into this. There was a study amongst the religionists happening around this, and then there was people trying to figure it out who weren't invested in the study of religion, but were looking at other areas. So amongst the religionists, you had the explicit theologians. They were typically presuming a church theology. James Cone might be the signal name that you could invoke around this. And then there were those who were like, okay, let's study religion, but it doesn't have to be just about Christianity. This is going to be a religious studies project. And you might invoke the name Charles Long in relationship to they had these tensions, or which way was it going to finally kind of congeal and break? I argue that when it finally started to calcify on that side, it broke in the direction of Black theology, what we now call Black theology. And there was some cost to pay for that. And I think it's trying to rectify itself now. I'm trying to contribute to that rectification. Then amongst the religionists, there was this other side, those who just sort of like, do we even bring religious studies or even theology into Black studies? And by the time that kind of broke, it kind of broke in a direction of somewhere between history, where Black studies got its anchor in history, became Black history studies, Black historians, or it broke in the direction of literature, kind of like Black African-American literary studies. You might think Gates on one side, and you might think some of the historians on the other, but then that became dominant, and it overshadowed the religionist side, whether you're talking about religious studies, Black religious studies, or even Black theological studies. And I think that we're in a moment where there's a reckoning that's trying to happen, trying to reopen that conversation and discussion about what is Black studies. And I think that's exactly where we are kind of right now. I'm trying to make my own contributions to what I think might be helpful in this moment, being trained as a religious studies scholar, but who takes Black studies with absolute seriousness.
So let me pick up on that last remark you made and ask you, you have your PhD in religious studies, you've worked in departments of religion, you're in the Department of African American Studies now, but also, as you've already talked about, have a commitment even when in religious studies or Department of Religion, to Black studies. And I'm curious how that relationship between, if we think about religious studies as a discipline,
Hmm.
if we would call it that. I mean, my sense of religious studies, which was my minor, but I don't want to speak too strongly because I was in college like 50,000 years ago. Um, but religion it's a discipline, but also has a kind of area studies feel to it as well.
Hmm.
But African American studies or Black studies is very much an area of studies, multi or anti-disciplinary in its nature. So I'm curious how you think that relationship between disciplinary demands, but also the way disciplinary training and teaching and writing, creates real rigor and insight. But then also being interested in and now working in an area of studies where things move in a very different kind of direction, have different kinds of sensibilities. So I'm curious to hear how you talk about how you think that's impacted you as both a scholar and a teacher. So both inside the classroom and in your writing, moving between area studies and disciplinary studies.
Yeah. Well, let me say something about Black studies as a discipline, and this is kind of is connected to the prior question and what I was, rambling about. So hopefully, it was a bit lucid, or at least I felt like I
That's
was rambling a
fantastic.
little bit. But I've been taken by something that Cedric Robinson said, in that Robin Kelly kind of brought back up in one of his essays in the Boston Review. Robinson says that Black studies is nothing less than the study of Western civilization as such.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fascinating statement. Sometimes I think I get it. Oftentimes, when I keep thinking about it, I was like, "This deeper than what I'm getting. I know it's more to it." And so I'm constantly like kind of like trying to reckon with that statement. But at root, what I like about it is to say that Black studies, in taking Black life as its object of study, can't help but be uber disciplinary. It's not even interdisciplinary. In some sense, it's transdisciplinary. In some sense, it's the critique of disciplinarity as such.
Mm-hmm.
It's another mode of knowing. It's not a mode of knowing invested in disciplinary knowing, which is a form of knowing that's going to be invested in almost like it's in, the university knowing is going to be a knowing that's invested in the segmentation and the breaking up of the object of study.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the study of Black life is something like not even the integration of different ways of looking at life. It's prior to the whole idea of integration, because integration presumes a disintegration first. And Black studies is trying to execute a form of knowing that's operating at this other level. But in order to get at that, it's got to make its kind of passageway through the situating of Black life within the horizon of Western civilization. So it can't help but take Western civilization as the thing it must not just think about, but think all the way through towards something that's on the other side of it. It's that which allows me to have started my professional career at a divinity school, have gone to a religious studies department, and now find myself in an AM studies department with an appointment as well in a comparative literature program. And on the advisory board for the department for the program in religious studies at Irvine. And so I've come to begin to think of myself as a Black studies thinker, but not as a disciplinary Black studies thinker, but as a Black studies thinker who's trying to think beyond the horizon of disciplinarity as such. And I think that means that I can't simply just be a religious studies person, because I think you're exactly right. Tomoko Masuzawa's book, The Invention of World Religions, I think is a signal text, if not the definitive text, on how the idea of religion as a key concept, within the organization of Western civilizational knowledges was at the epicenter of this segregation and individuating of knowledges through areas. Because the birth of the idea of religion, let's put it this way, the remaking of the idea of religion coming out of the 15th and 16th centuries with the rise of transatlantic slavery and so on and so forth, the idea of Africans being involved in fetish practices, that's like the root of the reimagination of the very idea of religion. And I say the reimagination because its original kind of like production comes out of in Greco-Roman antiquity. It was bound up with the practices of the state. Yeah, this is a project I'm actually now working on right now, but it gets then remade when it reaches the transatlantic in the 15th and 16th centuries. And this is when the idea of religion becomes an area, an organization of areas around the West, around Europe, and then more broadly the West. And so even when I'm a religious studies scholar, or even when I mobilize theology to do a certain kind of criticism work or the critique of theology, even when I'm doing that kind of work, part of what I'm doing is I'm trying to desediment thought from the segmentation and the areaization, to make a word, the areaization of knowledges where religion was at the epicenter of that stuff. This is why for me, Black studies it has to in big part be a critique of the very production of the notion of religion, the Christian notion of religion. It has to be.
Yeah, that's
and I
fantastic.
think this is what's lost. I think this is precisely one of the things that gets lost when religion simply gets read as something we can put to the side in Black studies. Now, of course, a big part of that is, here I might be getting into a little bit of making some mess, but I'll put it out there anyway. See what you think. See what others think. I do think that there's a certain class consciousness, perhaps, that comes with Black studies. The minute you bring it into university, there's a certain class dimension that now actually attaches itself to the project. And I wonder. Let's put it that way. Let me pose it as a question. I do wonder if a part of our reticence to engage the religious is also a reticence that's bound up with class, insofar as religion often gets read as close to the folk.
Yeah. I mean, it gets to some of the questions that you raised. I mean, it really wasn't a question that you raised, but your comments that started this conversation, right, about the philosophical dimension of ordinary life.
Yes.
And that really what we're doing. I mean, I hope I'm not overstating this because I have such a deep investment in this myself, but maybe it's why I like your work so much. But the philosophical dimension of everyday life and ordinariness, right? Once we get some distance from that, we're engaged in a completely different kind of project. Right. And I think that class dimension is really interesting because it's, you said you didn't want to make you might be making a mess, but also that's that way that, when you bring ordinariness, everydayness into philosophical inquiry and conversation, you've already made a mess of what the academy has wanted this space to be and what we've historically wanted this space to say. It's going to say something different. It's going to feel different, right? The affect dimension is going to be different. As stories are going to be different, and maybe the language itself is going to be different.
Absolutely. We'll almost circle back to something that you brought up in one of your other questions. It goes to the Black studies, origin of Black studies conversation, part of the conversation. Now, I've been thinking about, this organization that was also very much alive right at the moment when Black studies was being brought into becoming a university discipline, so to speak. Black studies / Black study preceded the university bringing it in the 1960s, right? So Black studies isn't born in the 1960s. What happens in the 1960s is a kind of introduction into predominant mainstream universities. And something happened. There's some pros and some cons to that. There's some ups, some positives, and some negatives, so to speak, to that. But there was another organization that was very much in existence at that time. It was called the Institute for the Black World, and
Mm-hmm.
of the 1960s. And, you know, a number of people were associated with it, not just university scholars or PhD scholars, but artists were associated with it. Yet Sylvia Wynter was connected with it. The James Cone, who eventually makes his way to Union Seminary, there's some evidence he had some connection with it. And a number of artists as well had connection with it. Sylvia Wynter's tome, Black Metamorphosis, is housed. The manuscript is housed in at the Schomburg, but this was written as a part of her work in the Institute for the Black World.
Huh.
And my whole point in bringing this up is that we've always had these other institutional space very close to the ground that were also an incubator of Black knowing, of Black knowledge, of alternate modes of knowing. That weren't invested in just simply the segregation of knowledges. And of course, the Institute for the Black World is arguably just one of the more recent kind of iterations of these alternate intellectual spaces. Of course, there was the Negro Academy that Du Bois was a part of. And then there was always these other kinds of close to the ground institutions where knowledges were happening. And I've been just really pondering lately, what happens when we locate the bread and butter of knowledge making, even of Black knowing, in the university only.
Yeah.
When we only have it there, because I think that's where we are basically right now, and I think it's coming at a certain cost.
Mm-hmm.
Inside of Black studies, as we reproduce some of the damages that go along with, the segregation of knowledges, right? The kind of how you acquire standing within these institutions of knowing. If that's the only mode of knowing only way we can go at knowing. So I've been trying to, first think about this, think about the Institute for the Black World as an institution that was also in play when Black studies is migrating into the university, and trying to think those two phenomena at the same time, and then trying to derive some lessons for right now about, well, what do we do with this? Are there other possibilities for how we might think about knowledge? And then finally, I'll say in some other aspects of my life, I'm trying to concretely think about and figure out how alternate spaces of Black knowing might reemerge. To get creative, because I'm of the view that we need more than just the university as the site of Black knowing. I think it's hampering us. I think it's hampering Black studies, and we got to figure out what it means to take another step.
Yeah. So it's when I'm listening to you to talk about this, I love that. I think it's really it's a really critical challenge. But it makes me think about how, in some ways, there's been great work that does that in relation to the past. I'm thinking about, and my students, if any student of mine is listening to this, they're going to be like, here, he always has to mention this book. But I absolutely love Angela Davis's Blues Legacies and Black Feminism book. And one of the things I love about it is, in trying to talk about, Black feminism, Black femininity, Black women's experience, she goes to blues music. She goes to Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith. And so when she does that, that's that moment of knowledge production not coming from even whatever the version of the academy would be at that moment, whether it's Du Bois's Negro Academy or, all the other kinds of intellectual work that's done through pamphlets and speeches and so forth. She goes to that, how to do that in the present or even the recent past. I think that's a quirky challenge, because I don't quite know where that gets footing. And so, because I think so much work in Black studies that wants to go outside academic knowledge production to do its research, sort of cultural studies dimension, turns to the loudest cultural production, whether it's, Whitney Houston or Beyonce or Prince or Michael Jackson, big stars. Right? But where is that other dimension of knowledge production, whether it's culture workers, or as you say, Black study, right? To use, I mean, in some ways, it's become kind of overused. But this notion of the undercommons, where's the undercommons? That's not me talking in the hallway to one of my colleagues,
Right. Yeah.
right? Where is that Black study happening, and how can that be experienced not as a source of data or absorption, but as a kind of insurgency in our lives, a challenge to what we do?
Yeah. See, now you're at the heart of this is really where this is it. This is it for me. This is the question that I'm really been toying with. I mean, I invoked my grandmother and my mother earlier, and I really want to understand them. I mean, the undercom. You're right. I mean, some of these terms are becoming overused. They're becoming like a kind of some sort of currency in there. And Fred Moten, that is, would totally not be for that. I mean, so, but that's it. I mean, when you think about like the undercommons, I want to think of my grandmother as involved in Black study. I want to think about the term the undercommons in such terms as Black study as um, late terms
Mm-hmm.
terms that are downstream from the practices of people like my grandma Hattie.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I'm trying to think about it. That they were doing this was Black study when Mr. Forston up the street. I'm talking about West Philly, down the bottom Mantua section of Philadelphia, down by the train tracks that go between Mantua section of West Philly and the Philadelphia Zoo that then would go downtown to Penn Station. When my grandmother couldn't get around because she didn't have a car, and one of the few people in the neighborhood who had a car was this man named Mr. Fortson up the street. When he would take people in the neighborhood around, to the grocery store, they had to get the King of Prussia to check on their Social Security check. And they couldn't take 15 buses to get up there. It would just take them half the day, if not all day, to get up there. And Mr. Forson's like, I got you. I'll take care of you. What kind of practice of the social is happening there?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a practice of Black study? I want to say yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
How do we bring to theoretical reflection what that is doing? That's what I'm interested in. Yeah. I think that's where we've got to figure out where to go. Another place, and here, I mean, I'm going to invoke the thing called the Black Church, knowing all of the problems with that singular term, but it's hopefully useful. I mean, I think this is another interesting thing about the Black Church. And here I'm going back to just to sort of localize it a little bit, because my grandmother was also a minister and a musician. She was an organist, and so she was deep into music, and also an unlettered preacher. Right? My grandmother didn't finish high school, but I mean, she's not unlike the figure in Beloved, in Toni Morrison's Beloved, the unchurched preacher. That was my grandmother. But I'm also thinking, like, say, for example, of the church in Charleston, South Carolina, that was his name, Dylan Roof, invade with all that violence. And it's not lost on me that he showed up in a moment of study.
Yeah.
That's when he showed up in a moment of study. Black church study. They were at Wednesday night Bible study. And they were involved in this kind of intense practice of gathering together to study something.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also an intense practice of gathering together to study something, but also it was invitational. Anybody could come in. It was a non-exclusionary gathering for study. Yeah. Non-exclusionary gathering for us to study what it means for us to try and get along in life. That's what they were doing, right? They had their own kind of Christian inflection to it. Okay, fine, but that's what they were doing. And that non-exclusionary openness, anybody can join into this practice of us getting together to figure out what it means for us to be together, to figure out what it means for us to make our way through life together, is invited. And that openness was the condition of possibility for Dylan Roof to show up in the first place.
Hmm.
He invaded the love that was also extending itself to him, and anybody for that matter. So blackness at that point wasn't just for black people. Blackness was a modality of the totality of entangled life. That's what it was. And I'm interested in those practices, those everyday quotidian practices. Ma Rainey on the stage might be another modality of this. When jazz musicians get together and they try and figure out what it means for them to make sound together, that's another iteration of all of this is black study, and all of this I think is a kind of sites for us to perhaps imagine other modes of knowing.
I love that. It's fantastic. And in some ways, I mean, you may have already responded to this question, but it's also a good time, I think, to ask it. Thinking about the institution of Black Studies, 50-something years of it at this point, I'm curious what you think it has done particularly well, but also what you think it hasn't done particularly well.
What has it done particularly well? At a minimum, it's helped a dude like me. I mean, and I mean that deeply and truly. I mean, I was trained in theological studies. I was trained in religious studies. I'm a latecomer to Black studies. I mean, I was reading it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, when I was at Virginia doing my graduate work, one of my teachers was Deborah McDowell, who works in literary studies, feminist studies, and working with her, took a seminar with her. It just kind of like just opened up vistas for me, and that was like kind of my first significant move into this is a field of study. There's some serious work happening here. And my training in religious studies was not giving me that. And so Black studies, and then of course, I eventually go to Duke. When I'm at Duke, there was this moment at Duke. It was a moment of profound intensity when I was at Duke. Not long after I got there, Fred Moten showed up. At one point, Houston Baker was there. Wanima Lubiano was there. Thinking of who did Patricia Holland was there. I mean, just a number of people were there. And I got to know these people and would hang out with them. We would have study groups together, reading with them, and just new vistas were opening for me. What has Black Studies done well? I think Black Studies have done well, just opening up, even inside the university, that there are other ways of knowing. And there are people who have been doing it profoundly well. And so it's done that exceptionally well. And I celebrate it. It was a saving grace for me. In fact, I even remember, I'll tell this story here. I remember when I was at Duke, and I was souring on the way in which theological studies was working. I mean, in substance, I'm always going to be related to theology. I mean, it's like where kind of my deepest intellectual formation. I'm constantly thinking about questions of theology, but I was increasingly doing it from the vantage point of Black study, and it created tensions. And I was contemplating leaving theological work and religious studies work, and the person who urged me to stay in was actually not somebody in religious studies and theology. Actually, it turned out to be Fred Moten. Fred Moten said to me, he said, Jay, this is rough paraphrasing years ago now, but this basically the gist of what he told me was, he said, you can come into English, you can come into literary studies, that would be cool. He said, if anything I could do to ever support you doing that, of course, consider it done. He said, but I sure hope you stay in religious studies. He said, because we need people in religious studies who know how to think deeply about Black studies, but bring these questions of religions back in. He said, it's a hole and we need to fix it. That encouraged me deeply to stay. And it made me like basically reboot the way I was going to do. So I think Black studies has done particularly well. Maybe it's just because of the kind of people I'm in conversation with. of helping me realize that Black studies is bigger than any discipline.
Mm-hmm.
It is a mode of knowing that exceeds all disciplinarity. It's done that. I see it as having done that exceptionally well. What I would like to see it do different or maybe better is, I think we have to find new ways of, I'm going back to what we said earlier now, because it's been heavily on my mind, and you gave me an outlet to start to talk about it. So now it's again fresh in my mind. I yearn for us to come up with new ways for us to get together, beyond just the ways in which the guilds call us together. Mm-hmm. I think the guilds call us together in a very hierarchical way, and it pushes to jostle for standing. Yeah. And I don't think this is good. I think in the end, it's detrimental to what Black Studies as a project. And I want to think of it as a project. That doesn't mean we all doing the same thing. Of course not. It's differential.
Yeah.
But the thing that we share is that different. It's precisely what we share. So I yearn for us to figure out how to do that different. I mean, and we have some historical things we can look at. We mentioned the Negro Academy. We mentioned these quotidian practices of what it means for Ma Rainey and so to be on the stage. We talked about a bunch of other. I was thinking about Présence Africaine, and could think diasporically. They're international aspects of this as well. Yeah. And I hope we find a way to reboot some of this. It's going to be different. I'm not saying redo what we did, but find out what a current iteration of that could be. And I don't think we know what it is, but we got to figure out what it means for us to get together so we can figure it out.
I mean, this part of institutionalization, right, is use the word guilds, what comes with that, or, professor appointments and conferences and committees and advisories, and all of which are essential to making it work. But I really like this invocation of other ways of being together. I do think it's a place where we just really lack imagination as intellectuals, which is very strange because it's supposed to be one of our calling cards. It's the imagination of other kinds of worlds, but we often don't apply it to ourselves. We apply it very quickly to other people. Yeah.
Ultimately, disciplinarity is conservative.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, disciplinarity is conservative, which is to say, it's a constriction on the imagination.
Yeah.
But I'll never forget that song. We got to dance our way out of our constrictions. We got to refuse constriction. We've got to be creative and imaginative, which is, again, one of the reasons I'm so taken by the artist. In fact, I'm increasingly come to understand myself as an intellectual artist. I want to be an artist. Thought work as artistry, and to be an artist, you must be imaginative. The imagination cannot be constricted. We must dance. I like to think about the Black Panther Party, and that word "party," of course, has the political connotation of a party, but I like to think of it as actually party. We get together and we party. We figure out what it means to be loose together. We dance. We party. And our radicalism must be the radicalism of radical party.
I mean, the Black Panther Party had a house band. That's not just a. I mean, they had great photographers. They had artists. The posters were not informational; they were works of art too. I like these as we don't have to invent this. It's not only exists, but it exists actually in things that we're doing that we're showing people in our classroom. So yeah. Let me ask you a big speculative question about the future of Black studies. When we were talking about the origins of the field, it's one of the features of the origin is just the utter absence of the treatment of Black life and disciplines in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I think one of the things we can say is that, and it's different in different fields, but Black studies as an institution in universities has changed disciplines. I think especially English departments and history departments, they're largely unimaginable without the study of Black life at this point. I mean, it's such a centerpiece. But pushing that further and further across all disciplines, it raises this question for me of how would we measure the future and the success of the field of Black studies? Would it be to basically position itself to dissolve into the transformation into other disciplines who have been so transformed by our work? Right. I know this is speculative, right, way in the future, but that moment of saying, disciplines that used to not study Black life now are so saturated with its presence, we don't need Black studies. Is that the success of Black studies, or is the success of Black studies to be something that is undissolvable, that isn't corrective and compensatory for those disciplines, but really something more like a discipline, something that has its methods that can't be replaced by those things that we've known as intellectual life and higher education for centuries at this point? So what marks a success? Is it the dissolution of Black studies in a speculative future, or becoming something more like something undissolvable?
That's a great question. Anything I'm about to say is complete, like, I'm testing it out. I don't know if this works.
That's all right.
But it's a great question because, I mean, one of the challenges around that comes with Black studies is sometimes a certain kind of, what's the language I'm looking for? Almost like a voyeurism, almost like, I'm thinking about what you're saying about like certain fields, they're hard to imagine them now without the centrality of kind of Black life to those fields. English clearly is one of them. But the question becomes, is it that, okay, now we're taking Black life seriously, and it has done the work of reviving us, or revivifying us. That's what its work was, right? And so in that sense, you almost get a kind of duplication of kind of abstract art, so to speak. It can turn into the 20th century abstract art, Picasso, so on and so forth, right? A form of artistry that gets animated by the encounter with Africa. And rather than just saying, oh, that's just some sort of savagery, it becomes the animus. It helped to now revive and reanimate art. I've been thinking about the curious relationship of Blackness to, say, for example, the surrealism of even a Bataille. How the notion of Black works in some of his writings. Is it in its own way doing a kind of Picasso thing? I haven't worked out the answer, and I'm actually working on something, writing about this and thinking about this. My preliminary argument is I think that unwittingly it may be. I think it's unwitting in Bataille, though. I don't think it's intentional. But anyway, the point is, how does the figure of the Black work for the disciplines? Can there now, there once was a rejection of it. Oh, there's not no real knowledge going on there. Well, is it now that there's an embrace of it? And so on one level, Black studies gets dissolved into the disciplines so as to reanimate those disciplines. I think you do see some of that, if I'm honest. That's not the kind of dissolution I would be interested in at all. Is there another way to think about this? And here's where I'm speculating with you. I'm wondering if maybe a way to think about it is what we would want Black studies to do is to help each and every discipline come to some sort of terms with how its disciplinary machine is working to reproduce a world of segregation and segmentation and antagonism. And the upshot of that is not simply oh, we got to figure a way to now fix the problem, because then once we fix the problem, we can move on. But in some sense, maybe the work of Black Studies is to keep the tension alive, to, to keep alive the way in which knowledge is structured according to disciplines in the apparatus we call the university is going to constantly require us to meditate on how every move is poised to reinscribe the university. The university form of knowledge it's protean. It can adapt and adjust itself to new realities to keep itself alive. It's invested in its ongoing life, its ongoing form of knowing and existing. That would mean then that Black studies are going to have to constantly be a form of knowledge and a presence in the university structure to keep constant kind of pressure on the disciplines for how they will attempt to absorb the other to reanimate itself.
Mm-hmm.
The constant reanimation of itself is precisely what the university machine is all about.
Yeah.
It does not want to see its own dissolution. So even when it encounters the so-called other, it's for the sake of a kind of reproducing itself, keeping itself going. And that's where I think the work of Black studies is going to be not so much that it dissolves, but it's going to be putting a constant pressure on the university structures of knowing for how those structures work to keep itself alive.
Yeah. Resisting cannibalism. Right?
Yeah.
How do you not be cannibalized? How do you not be that sacrificial body?
Exactly.
And I mean, what I hear, it's interesting hearing you talk about this, but also in thinking about it alongside of what you've talked about pretty extensively about other forms of knowledge production outside academic circles. It is a sort of, I'm starting to get this picture of Black studies as this intensely antagonistic space, antagonistic towards the disciplines, right? Asking those provocative questions, but refusing to be their sacrifice, refusing to be sort of cooked and consumed, but also being antagonized by these other forms of knowledge production that we aren't in control of, right?
Right.
So it may make for a little bit more anxious life here in our departments, but I love this idea. I mean, that's also vitality and energy, and there's no complacency when you're antagonized and the antagonizer.
Yeah, I really love your imagery here of the cannibal. I love it because because there's a nice irony around it, right? Colonizers showed up into what we now call the Americas, right? They show up, and the accusation, slash denigration is that they're cannibals, right? They're less than they're not civilized. They're cannibals, and in effect, what's happened is those they encountered were also being cannibalized. The colonizers were cannibalists. Right? Their Eucharistic Christian practice of eating the host had this cultural inflection as well, where they were literally eating a host. But what's so interesting, I mean, I wrote this essay, it came out maybe a couple years ago, called The Excremental Sacred, the Excremental Sacred, Paraliturgy, and really was a meditation on a phrase, a moment in Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism. And he says that he's commenting on the colonial administrator of Madagascar, Georges Bidault, and he says that he's in the French Assembly, French Congress, where all of the legislators are meeting or whatever, and Bidault shows up to give a report on the war, the fighting that's happening in Malagasy, because the French were getting their asses kicked. Give a report. And Césaire reflects on what he saw, because he's in the assembly. He's looking, he says these words, at least in the English translation. George Bidault, standing there, looking like a communion wafer dipped in, the translator says, shit. In this image here, communion wafer dipped in excrement, and it got me thinking about the liturgical imbalances. Okay, he's clearly playing on French culture as a Catholic culture. People would get this reference. I said, but okay, Who's the host? Who's being eating? How's the sacrament working here? How do I think the sacrament within the logics of coloniality? I mean, Cesare opened all this up for me, so I wrote this essay trying to make some sense of it. And
Love it.
it turns out that the way he works this out is that the colonized are at once being consumed, cannibalistically ingested, but what's ingested can't be held down, it's excremented. There's an excess, right? Even in the gesture of the attempt to cannibalize it, even as our different disciplines will like kind of cannibalize what Black Studies offers, it can't hold it down if the goal here is to just assimilate it so that then we can reanimate ourselves. That gesture to assimilate it and hold it down, the bowels of the colonial beast can't hold it down. There's an excess that constantly has it come back and push more challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Black Studies is that practice. Even at the moment of would-be ingestion, liturgical cannibalistic ingestion, there's that which cannot be consumed. And this is its excremental sacrality, its excremental holiness, if I can dare put it that way, of the practice of Black study.
So I really love this image of the undigestible as a way of characterizing the future of Black studies, because I like the idea of the transformation that Black studies work has had, the effect Black studies work has had on disciplines, but that specter of ingestion, right, of being eaten and taken in, and therefore no longer having our own independent life. I mean, it troubles me. So I really like this idea of, how do we produce things that have an undigestible antagonism? Because antagonisms do affect people. When we antagonize people, I mean, people do take that thoughtfulness into them, but we also maintain that distance. So
that's right.
I think it's a very rich image. And maybe in that spirit, as I'll ask this last question to ask you to think about your own thoughts on the field of Black studies and its future, and just simply ask, what do you think is the most urgent question we should all be asking? What should we be talking about in Black studies?
Wow. I know what's important, what's urgent kind of for me. And I guess it'd be no surprise for me to say, I think that questions of religion or religiosity, or we might say the more than. I mean, because I don't want us to, in some sense, the notion of religion needs itself to be liberated. We need to have a much more expansive approach to what religion or the questions of religion are about. And one way maybe to do that is to sort of understand that in some sense, the heart of the question of religion is what's possible beyond what is. Mm-hmm. How do we understand what is as just one possibility, but there are possibilities beyond what is? And we might sort of, with maybe that expansive view, then understand questions of religion as in some sense in play. Or if we take Black studies to be about the questions of what's possible in the face of what is, that what is not a totality. What is has no claim to completion, but rather the incomplete, and therefore the possible is the thing we might need to be attending to. If we approach it that way, then the questions of religion can come back into circulation, and not reductively so that when you're talking about religion, you're only talking about Black church or Christianity or something like that, which I think is one of the things that kind of has freaked out some people in Black studies. And I'm the first one to say I get it, because I don't valorize religion as some sort of perfect oasis. There's problems with religion even in Black Christianity, right? So I wouldn't want to sort of valorize religion or have people hear religion only in that frame. But if we understand Black study as the study of what exceeds what is, because what is not a totality or a finality, that we don't need to approach what is as an ontologist might, right? So that the current state is all that there is. If we don't do that, then the work of Black studies becomes interestingly juxtapositional to what sometimes we've come to think about under the banner of religion. Insofar as we're trying to think about an excess, a more than. I think that these are the questions that are before us. At least the questions that I would love for us to attend to more than. In some sense, I both appreciate the question, but don't want to completely concede to it either, because I don't think that there's just one question that that Black studies needs to be really having its eye on. But I do think that whatever questions we do have our eye on, we need to have our eye on them with a view to that larger horizon of the more than, about what's possible, about ecological as social possibilities beyond what is. I think that these are the urgent questions. I think that when we think Black studies simply within a university framework of Black studies or African American studies or in the whole host of studies, when we think about it that way, I think in some sense we're conceding to the current order of knowledge production. We actually are functioning like ontologists at that point. And I'm not an ontologist. In that sense, I don't want to get too far in the weeds about what I mean by that. But if by ontology we mean a capitulation to what is, right? The to be of ontology, a capitulation to what is, I'm not an ontologist. I do not concede to the fact that what is all there can be. Mm-hmm. One is just one vector of what can be. Only one vector. And we've always been about the work of imagining otherwise. It's in that sense that I'm not an ontologist. I'm an imaginative, at least I want to be. I aspire to be an imaginative thinker. I've actually published some poetry. When people ask me, it's like, so are you a poet? I was like, I've written some poetry. I wouldn't claim to be a poet. When I'm in my dreams, I dream myself to be a poet, the way in which I dream myself to be a musician too.
Well, I love this as a place to conclude our conversation, invocations of the richest and deepest stakes of the imagination as part of Black study, and the way that animates everything that we do, or ought to animate more deeply, maybe, everything we do. And that as a way of reconnecting with this idea of religion. That's just fantastic. And, as I said at the beginning, I love your work. I love the sincerity and intensity of it. And I just was really happy to talk with you today. I mean, it really brought home, I think, for everybody who listens, the seriousness of what we do as writers and thinkers and participants in the imagination. So thank you so much for your time, but really thank you for your thoughtfulness, because it's given me a lot to think about. And anybody who listens, it's going to fill all of us with ideas about what we do, how we ought to do it, and ways to think about Black studies, Black life, Black study, institutions, and anti-institutions. And those are real gifts. So thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for having me. And I just want to underscore one last time that I'm a fan of your work too. Your work has really been so helpful to me on so many levels. So thank you. And this has been a joy of a conversation. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure on my side too. Thank you. I appreciate that, and have a good rest of your day.
Okay. You too.
All right. Take care.